Ladies and gentlemen, the Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Honorable Jim Leach.
Good evening. On behalf of the National Endowment for the Humanities, it's my pleasure to welcome each of you to the 42nd Jefferson Lecture. The first Jefferson Lecture was delivered in 1972. Richard Nixon was President of the United States and chose to redirect American foreign policy outward, journeying to China. The Watergate break-in also occurred that year, causing history to be bent inward in a less noble fashion. Enduring questions have been the foundation of the Jefferson Lecture for nearly half a century. Tonight's Jefferson Lecture takes the ancient medium of the speech and updates it for modern audiences. It is being live-streamed across the country, indeed around the world. We deeply appreciate those who have helped defray the cost of this evening. In particular, we want to thank American Express and HBO for their extraordinary generosity, and the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts for its special consideration of our needs. We're also greatly appreciative of the faithful support of the National Trust for the Humanities, the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities, and Paul L. Peck. The Jefferson Lecture is the federal government's most prestigious honor for distinguished intellectual achievement in the humanities. Its recipients until now have been masters of the written word. This year, we emphasize through the presentation of this lecture that intellectual achievement can occur in realms other than that of the classroom and the book. The Jefferson Lecture for 2013 is Martin Scorsese, the acclaimed director and producer of some 50 films. Martin Scorsese is on every list of the world's most outstanding directors. He has directed such landmark films as Mean Street, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The King of Comedy, Goodfellas, Age of Innocence, Casino, Kundun, Gangs of New York, The Departed, and most recently, Hugo. His films are grounded in a sense of time and place. And though they are strikingly diverse in subject and style, they are known for incorporated camera and editing techniques from different genres, and for distinctive treatments of signature themes of isolation and ethnic identity, violence and loss, guilt and redemption, faith and spirituality. Mr. Scorsese was born in New York, graduated from New York University, where he also received a Master of Arts degree. He is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Academy Award for Best Director, 3 Golden Globe Awards for Best Director, an Emmy for Best Director Series, and the American Film Institute's Lifetime Achievement Award. He received the 2010 Cecil B. DeMille Award at the Golden Globe Awards and the Palme d'Or and Best Director Award at the Cannes Film Festival. He was decorated with the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic and the French Legion of Honor, and was honored at the 2007 Kennedy Center Honors for his contributions to cinema. After his lecture, Mr. Scorsese will be joined on the stage by Kent Jones for a conversation. Mr. Jones is a widely respected film programmer, writer, critic, and director who has worked with Martin Scorsese for many years, both in filmmaking and in film preservation and preservation. Mr. Jones serves as artistic director of the World Cinema Foundation, founded by Mr. Scorsese to preserve and distribute neglected films from around the globe. In 2012, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce Martin Scorsese for the 2013 Jefferson Lecture entitled Persistence of Vision, Reading the Language of Cinema. Thank you.
Now then, where are you off to?
Come quickly, come on, come and see.
Now, just a minute. What is all this?
No, come and see. I've got something to show you. Something I've done. You must come and see.
Something you've done.
Yes, come on, and I'll show you. It's only a little way. You see, I've only just this minute done it. I was frightened, I don't mind telling you, frightened out of my wits, but I've done it. And though I dare say it's very foolish of me, I feel I've simply got to show someone. And the joke is, Cousin Alfred didn't even know what I was doing. He just stared and said, "Hello, Willie, what have you got there?" And now there he is, and you can see him, almost as if he were alive. Here we are now.
Where is it?
Where's what?
What you've done.
Oh, just sit down there, you'll see. Now, would you mind turning out your lamp? Good. Now, what's that white sheet?
That was Hyde Park. I recognized it. Where's it come from? And where's it gone to?
It's all here. Here, look. That's where the Hyde Park you saw is. Like a magic lantern.
But it moved.
Yes, it moved, didn't it? Now, look at this strip of celluloid film. It's taken me years to get to that. Years. That's the secret. Dozens of snapshots of Hyde Park. Only in one picture, the carriage is here, the next is here, the next is here, the next is here, and so on. Now, look at the mechanism. You see, the film, that's what it's called, comes from this spool over these rollers. That's for tension. You've got to have tension onto this second spool down here. Now, look in the middle. It's a bit like a magic lantern. But instead of one picture at a time, you see 8 or more pictures every second. And that's what you see on that sheet there. 8 pictures every second. And they all merge together into one moving, living picture. See? Of course, there's a bit more to it than that. I'm not saying it's perfect. Far from it. But it works. God be praised, it works, doesn't it? You can see that. You know, it's a quite extraordinary feeling. Something you've been wondering about and dreaming about for 15 years. And then, all of a sudden, it's there. It's in your hands. With a life of its own.
You must be a very happy man, Mr. Freeze Green.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This scene is from a picture called The Magic Box, which was made in England in 1950. And the great English actor Robert Donat plays the inventor William Friese-Greene. He was one of the people who invented movies. And The Magic Box was packed with guest stars. It was made for an event called the Festival of Britain. And you had about maybe 50 or 60 of the biggest actors in England at the time, all doing, for the most part, little cameos, including the man who played the policeman, that was Sir Laurence Olivier. It's the only time he's in the film. So I saw this picture for the first time with my father. I was 8 years old, and I have never really gotten over the impact that it had. And I believe this is what ignited in me the wonder of cinema and the obsession. Watching movies, making them, inventing them. Friese-Greene gives everything of himself to the movies, and he dies poor. He dies a pauper. That line, "You must be a very happy man, Mr. Friese-Greene," of course, is ironic, knowing the full story of his life. But in some ways it's also true because he's followed his obsession all the way. So it's both disturbing and inspiring. I was very young. I mean, I couldn't put this into words when I saw this, but I mean, I sensed them. I sensed these ideas and these things, and I saw them up there on the screen. And then my parents had a good reason for taking me to the movies all the time, because I was always sick with asthma since I was 3 years old, and I apparently couldn't do any sports, so that's what they told me. But really, my mother and father did love the movies. They weren't in the habit of reading. That didn't really exist where I came from. And so we connected through the movies. And over the years, I know now that the warmth of that connection with my family and with the images up on the screen gave me something very precious, because we were experiencing something fundamental together. We were living through the emotional truths on the screen together, often in coded form, these films from the 40s and 50s. Sometimes they're expressed in small things, gestures, glances, reactions between the characters, light, shadow. I mean, we experience these things that we normally couldn't discuss or wouldn't discuss or even acknowledge in our own lives. And that's actually part of the wonder. So whenever I hear people dismiss movies as fantasy, I make a hard distinction between film and life, I think to myself that it's just a way of avoiding the power of cinema. I mean, of course it's not life. It's the invocation of life. It's an ongoing dialogue with life. Frank Capra said, film is a disease. He went on, but that's enough for now. I caught the disease early on, I used to feel it. They used to take me to the movies all the time. I used to feel it whenever we walked up to the ticket booth with my mother and my father and my brother. You go through the doors and the thick carpet, past the popcorn stand where it had that wonderful smell, then to the ticket taker. And then sometimes these doors would open in the back, and there were little windows in it in some of these old theaters, and I could see something magical happening up there on the screen, something special. And as we entered, for me, I think now it was like entering a sacred space, kind of a sanctuary where the living world around me seemed to be recreated and played out. I mean, what was it about cinema? What was so special about it? I mean, I think I've discovered some of my own answers to that question a little bit at a time over the years. First of all, there's light. Light is at the beginning of cinema, of course. It's fundamental because it's created with light. And it's still best seen projected in dark rooms where it's the only source of light. But light is also at the beginning of everything. Most creation myths start with darkness, and then the real beginning comes with light, which means the creation of forms, which leads to distinguishing one thing from another and ourselves from the rest of the world, recognizing patterns, similarities, differences, naming things, interpreting the world, metaphors, seeing one thing in light of something else, becoming enlightened. So light is at the core of who we are and how we understand ourselves. And then there's movement. I remember when I was about 5 or 6, somehow I was able to see someone project a 16-millimeter cartoon in a small projector, and I was allowed to look inside the projector, and I saw these little still images passing mechanically through the gate at a very, very steady rate of speed. And in the gate, they were upside down. but they were moving. And on the screen, they came out right side up, moving. At least there was a sensation of movement. But it was really more than that. Something clicked then, right there. Pieces of time. That's how James Stewart, the great actor, defined movies in a conversation with Peter Bogdanovich. That wonder I felt when I saw these little figures move. That's what Laurence Olivier feels when he watches those first moving images in that scene from The Magic Box. The desire to make images move, the need to capture movement, seems to be with us 30,000 years ago in the cave paintings of Chauvet, as you can see here. In this image, the bison appears to have multiple sets of legs. Maybe that was the artist's way of creating the impression of movement. I think this need to recreate movement is a mystical urge. It's an attempt to capture the mystery of who and what we are, and then to think about that, to contemplate that mystery. Which brings us to the boxing cats. Yes. Yes, these are the boxing cats. This appears to be two cats boxing. It was shot in 1894 in Thomas Edison's Black Maria studio that he had in New Jersey. It was actually a little shack. This is one of hundreds of little scenes that he and his team recorded with his kinetograph. It's probably one of the lesser-known scenes. There are better-known ones of a blacksmith, the heavyweight champion Jim Corbett boxing, Annie Oakley, the great sharpshooter from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. At some point somebody had the idea that, two cats boxing apparently is what went on in New Jersey at the time. Now, can you say anything about now? Okay. Edison, of course, was one of the people who invented film. And there's been a lot of debate about who really invented film. There was Edison, the Lumiere brothers in France, Friese Greene and R.W. Paul in England. And actually, you can go back to a man named Louis Laprince, who shot a little home movie in 1888. But then you could go back even further to the motion studies of Edward Muybridge, which were made in the 1870s, 1880s. He would he would set a number of still cameras side by side, and then he'd trigger them to take photos in succession of people and animals in movement. His employer, Leland Stanford, bet him that all four of a horse's hooves do not leave the ground when the horse is running. But as you can see here, Muybridge won the bet. All four hooves do leave the ground at the same time while the horse is galloping. Does cinema really begin with Muybridge, or should we go all the way back to the cave paintings? In his novel, Joseph and His Brethren, Thomas Mann writes, "The deeper we sound, the further down into the lower world of the past we probe and press, the more do we find that the earliest foundations of humanity, its history and culture, reveal themselves unfathomable." All beginnings are unfathomable. The beginning of human history, the beginning of cinema. Now this film, by the Lumiere brothers in France, is commonly recognized as the first publicly projected film. It was shot in 1895, and when you watch it, it really is 1895. The way they dress, the way they move. It's now, the present, and it's then, at the same time. And that's the third aspect of cinema that makes it so uniquely powerful. It's the element of time. Again, pieces of time. When we made the movie Hugo, we went back and tried to recreate that first screening when people were so startled to see this image that they jumped back. They thought the train was going to hit them, you see. And when we studied the Lumiere film, because we had to use the original, we could see right away that it was very different from the Edison films. They weren't, these films that the Lumiere did, they weren't just setting up the camera to record events or scenes. This film is composed. When you study it, you can see how carefully they placed the camera, the thought that went into what was in the frame, what was left out of the frame, the distance between the camera and the train, the height of the camera, the angle of the camera. And what's interesting is that if the camera had been placed even a little bit differently, the audience probably wouldn't have reacted the way they did. Now, in Hugo, we converted the Lumiere film to 3D. and we combined it with our 3D image here. But it didn't have the same effect. And we discovered we had to do it in 2 dimensions within a 3D image, because the composition by the Lumiere brothers was designed to create the illusion of depth within a flat surface. So in essence, the Lumieres weren't just recording events the way they did in the Edison studio. They were really interpreting reality and telling a story with just one angle. And of course, so was Georges Méliès. Méliès began as a magician, and his pictures were made to be part of his live magic act. He created trick photography, incredible handmade special effects, and in so doing, he sort of remade reality. The screen in his pictures is like opening a magic cabinet of curiosities and wonders. Now, over the years, Lumiere's and Lumiere brothers and Méliès have been consistently portrayed as opposites. One film reality, the other film special effects. Of course, this happens all the time. It's a way of simplifying history, but in essence, they were both heading in the same direction. They were just taking different roads. They were taking reality and interpreting it, reshaping it, and trying to find meaning in it. And then everything went further, was taken further with the cut. Who made the first cut from one image to another? Meaning a shift from one vantage point to another, with the viewer understanding that we're still within one continuous action. Again, to quote Thomas Mann, unfathomable. But as far as we know, this is one of the earliest and most famous examples of a cut from Edwin S. Porter's 1903 milestone film, The Great Train Robbery. Now, even though we cut here, he cuts from the interior of the car to the exterior, we know we're in one unbroken action. And this film is one of the dozens of one-reel films that D.W. Griffith made in 1912. It's a remarkable film called The Musketeers of Pig Alley, commonly referred to as the first gangster film, and actually it's a great Lower East Side New York street film. Now, if you watch, the gangsters are crossing quite a bit of space before they get to Pig Alley, which is actually a recreation of a famous Jacob Riis photo of Bandit's Roost from the 5 Points. But you know, you're not seeing them cross that space on the screen. Yet, you are seeing it. You're seeing it all in your mind's eye. You're inferring it. And this is the 4th aspect of cinema that's so special. That inference, that image in the mind's eye. For me, it's where the obsession began. It's what keeps me going, actually. It never fails to excite me, because you take one shot, you put it together with another shot, and you experience a third image in your mind's eye that doesn't really exist in those 2 other images. The Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, wrote about this, and it was at the heart of all the films he did. And this is what fascinates me, though. It's frustrating sometimes. It's always exciting. Because if you change the timing of the cut, even slightly, by just a few frames or even one frame, then the third image in your mind's eye changes too. And that has been called, appropriately, I believe, film language. Now, in 1916, D.W. Griffith made a picture, an epic called Intolerance, in part as an act of atonement for the racism in Birth of a Nation. Intolerance ran about 3 hours. But he goes further. He goes further with the idea of the cut. He shifts between 4 different stories. The first story is the massacre of the Huguenots. And the second story is the Passion of Christ. The third is a spectacle, really, the fall of Babylon. And a fourth story, which was a modern American story, set in 1916, as you see here, the train. Now, at the end of the picture, what Griffith did is that he cut between the different climaxes of these different stories. He cross-cut through time, something that had never really been done before. He tied together images, not for story purposes or narrative purposes, but to illustrate an idea, thesis. In this case, the thesis was that intolerance has existed throughout the ages, and it's always destructive. Now, Eisenstein later wrote about this kind of editing and gave it a name. He called it intellectual montage. For the writers and commentators who were very, very suspicious of movies because, after all, it did start as a Nickelodeon storefront attraction, This was the element that signified film as an art form. But of course, it already was an art form. That started with Lumiere and Méliès and Porter. This was just another logical step in the development of the language of cinema. Now, that language has taken us in many directions. For instance, here, into the pure abstraction of the extraordinary avant-garde filmmaker Stan Brakhage. Well, here, this is a commercial very well done by the visual artist and filmmaker Mike Mills, made for an audience that's seen thousands of commercials. The images come at you so fast that you have to make the connections after the fact. But film language has also taken us here. This is the Stargate sequence from Stanley Kubrick's monumental 2001: A Space Odyssey. Narrative, abstraction, speed, movement, stillness, life, death, they're all up there. And again, we find ourselves back at that mystical urge to explore, to create movement, go faster and faster, maybe find some kind of peace at the heart of it. A state of pure being. The cinema we're talking about here, Edison, the Lumiere brothers, Méliès, Porter, all the way through Griffith, and all the way through Kubrick, that's really almost gone. It's been overwhelmed by moving images coming at us all the time and absolutely everywhere, even faster than the visions coming at the astronaut in the Kubrick picture. I mean, classical cinema, as it's come to be called, kind of feels now like grand opera of Verdi or Puccini. That period. And we're no longer talking about celluloid. That really is a thing of the past. For many film lovers, this is a great sadness and a sense of loss. I certainly feel it myself. I grew up with celluloid and its particular beauty and its idiosyncrasies. But cinema's always been tied to technological development. And if we spend too much time lamenting what's gone, then we're going to miss the excitement of what's happening now. I mean, everything's wide open. To some, this is a cause for concern. But I think it's an exciting time precisely because we don't know what tomorrow will bring, let alone next week. And we have no choice but to treat all these moving images coming at us as a language. We need to be able to understand what we're seeing and find the tools to sort it all out. We certainly agree now that verbal literacy is necessary. But a couple of thousand years ago, Socrates actually disagreed. His argument was almost identical to the arguments of people today who object to the internet, who think that it's a sorry replacement maybe for real research in a library. In the dialogue with Phaedrus, written by Plato, Socrates worries that writing and reading will actually lead to the student not truly knowing it. That once people stop memorizing and start writing and reading, they're in danger of cultivating the mere appearance of wisdom rather than the real thing. Now, we take it for granted. Reading and writing are taught in schools. But the same kinds of questions are coming up around moving images. Are they harming us? Are they causing us to abandon written language? Now, we're face to face with images all the time in a way that we never have been before, and that's why I believe we need to stress visual literacy in the schools. Young people need to understand that not all images are there to be consumed, like, fast food and then forgotten. We need to educate them to understand the difference between moving images that engage their humanity and their intelligence and moving images that are just, selling them something. In fact, as Steve Apkin, a film producer and founder of the Jacob Burns Film Center in Pleasantville, New York, points out in his new book, The Age of the Image, he says the distinction between verbal and visual literacy needs to be done away with, along with the tired old arguments about the word and the image and which is more important. They're both important. They're both fundamental. Both take us back to the core of who we are. I mean, when you look at ancient writing, words and images are almost indistinguishable. In fact, words are images. They're symbols. Written Chinese and Japanese still seem like pictographic languages. And at a certain point, exactly when is unfathomable, but words and images diverged, like two rivers or two different paths to understanding. But in the end, there really is only literacy. At the Film Foundation, which I founded in 1990, we actually developed a curriculum called The Story of Movies, which we make available for free to any teacher who wants it. So far, 100,000 educators have used it in their classrooms. We've created 3 study units around certain titles, one of which is a 1951 film called The Day the Earth Stood Still, which, as you can see, was shot not too far from here. Now, why this picture? Because it's beautifully made in black and white, because it's Hollywood at its best during the era that I think really deserves the name of the Golden Age, because it's one of the really great science fiction pictures of the 50s. And there's another reason. The American film critic Manny Farber said that every movie transmits the DNA of its time. The Day the Earth Stood Still was made right in the middle of the Cold War, and it has the tension, the paranoia, the fear of nuclear disaster, the fear of the end of life on planet Earth, and a million other elements more difficult to put into words. These elements have to do with the play of light and shadow, the emotional, psychological interplay between the characters, the atmosphere of the time woven into the action, the choices that were made behind the camera and that resulted in the immediate film experience for viewers like myself and my parents. These are the aspects of a film that reveal themselves in passing. The things that bring the movie to life for the viewer, but they just go by, you see. And the experience becomes even richer, however, when you explore these elements much more closely. Gort. Yeah, but what happens when a movie's seen out of its time? For me, 1951 was my present when I saw it. I was 9. For someone born 20 years later, when they see the movie, it's a different story. Now, someone born today, they'll see it with completely different eyes and a whole other frame of reference. Different values, uninhibited by the biases of the time when the picture was made. Because you can only see the world through your own time, which means that some values disappear and some values come into closer focus. Same film, same images, but in the case of a great film, the power, a timeless power that really can't be articulated, that power is there even when the context has completely changed. But in order to experience something and find new values in it, it's got to be there in the first place. You have to preserve it, all of it. Certainly archaeologists have made many discoveries by studying, what we throw away, the refuse of earlier civilizations, the things that we consider expendable. For example, the Sumerian tablet is not a poem, it's not a legend. Actually, a record of livestock and business, balance sheet, business transactions. Miraculously, it's been preserved for centuries, first under layers of earth and now in a climate-controlled environment. And when we still find objects like this, we immediately take great care with them. And we certainly do have to do the same thing with film. But film isn't made of stone. Until recently, it was all made of celluloid, as I said before, thin strips of nitrocellulose, the first plastic compound. And through the late 1940s, before nitrate film was replaced by safety film, nitrate film caught fire. It blew up. It could turn to powder and explode. In the 1950 was replaced with safety stock. With a few exceptions, preservation wasn't even discussed at that time. It was something that happened by accident. Some of the most celebrated movies were the victims of their own popularity. Every time they were re-released, they were often printed from the original negatives. And in the process, they were run into the ground, the negatives. Because film is so fragile, it didn't really sink in at the time. It wasn't so long ago that nitrate films were melted down just to get the silver content back. In the 70s and 80s, prints of films made in the 70s and 80s were recycled to make guitar picks and plastic heels for shoes. It's a disturbing thought, just as disturbing as knowing that those extraordinary glass photographic plates taken at the Civil War not long after the birth of photography were later sold, some were later sold to gardeners for building greenhouses. And whatever plates survived are here in the Library of Congress. So when I hear the question, interestingly enough, some people are still asking it, why preserve anything? I just think of those stories, all that silent film, all those images of the silent war, and there was no consciousness of their lasting value. That only came later. Why preserve? Well, because we can't know where we're going unless we kind of know where we've been. Can't understand the future of the present until we have some sort of grappling with the past. And I became involved with the cause of preservation in the early 80s when I really understood just how fragile film was. And since the early 90s, around the time we formed the Film Foundation, which was actually an idea by Bob Rosen, to put all of us together, myself and a number of other directors, Spielberg and Lucas and Coppola and Robert Redford, Sidney Pollack. The Film Foundation, this was formed to bring the studios together with the archives. That was a difficult relationship at the time. And I think there actually, since that time, has been a shift in consciousness and much more awareness of the need for preservation, which is ongoing, by the way, because it isn't something that you do once. You have to keep going back, constantly, moving the films from one format to another to make sure they survive, because it's an endless process. Today, we have some really wonderful tools, though. When the time came to restore Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's The Red Shoes, one of my very, very favorite films and one of the best films ever made, we were really fortunate to have these tools at our disposal. And I thought it would just show you a little bit of the restoration demonstration Thelma Schoonmaker put together for the Blu-ray of that film, to give you an idea of the kind of work that was involved. It took years to get this going and was quite expensive. But you must bear in mind that The Red Shoes was shot in the old 3-strip Technicolor style, I should say technology, with very, very heavy cameras that had not one but 3 rolls of film going through it at the same time.
First, you will see an approximation of how the 3 color records were printed one on top of the other with dye to make the finished print. Our breath was taken away by the richness of the color that was still there even 61 years later. However, you will see some of the damage that had to be corrected, such as mold damage. Now you are seeing only one of the 3 black and white records, the blue record, to show the damage caused by the mold on the negative, which was eating away at the film's emulsion. The cracks created by the mold had to be erased digitally. Robert Gitt supervised the restoration team. Over 500,000 frames of film had to be evaluated for damage caused by mold, dirt, and shrinkage. Now here are all the color records recombined before restoration and after. It's before, after. Warner Brothers Motion Picture Imaging digitally scanned each of the 3 original negatives at 4K resolution, which matches the image quality of the film. Next, you'll see how the different levels of shrinkage in the 3 strips of film caused misregistration and blurring of the image. Luckily, this could also be corrected digitally.
Hello, Professor. Now, please don't get up, Mr. Lermontov.
Well, none of that could have been possible without this digital technology. That's for certain. But I do have to say, of course, that we are too late. Over 90% of all silent films ever made are gone. lost forever. I mean, every time a silent picture by some miracle turns up, like John Ford's film he made in 1927 called Upstream, which was recently discovered by the National Film Preservation Foundation in an archive in New Zealand. I mean, every time one of those shows up, we have to remember that there are probably hundreds, maybe thousands that are gone forever. So we have to really take good care of what's left. Everything, from the acknowledged masterworks of cinema to industrial films, home movies, anthropological films, anything that reminds us, that could tell us who we are ultimately. And here's one example of why we have to look beyond the officially honored, recognized, and enshrined, and why we have to preserve everything systematically. Well, that's from a 1958 picture directed by Alfred Hitchcock that I'm sure many of you have seen by now, called Vertigo. When this film came out, some people liked it, some didn't, and then it just went away. It just ran its course through the theaters, the different chains. And even before it came out, it was classified as another picture from the master of suspense, and that was it. End of story. Because almost every year at that time, it was amazing, because almost every year there was a new Hitchcock picture. It was almost like a franchise. But that was the 50s. It's quite an amazing amount of work. But at a certain point, there was a reevaluation of Hitchcock, thanks to the critics in France, who later became the directors of the French New Wave, and to the American film critic Andrew Sarris, because they all enhanced our vision of cinema and helped us to understand the idea of authorship behind the camera. And when the idea of film language started to be taken seriously, so did Hitchcock, because his films seemed to have an innate sense of visual storytelling. And the more closely you looked at his pictures, the richer and more emotionally complex they became. Now, ironically, as people were starting to recognize the Hitchcock genius, several of his most important pictures were suddenly unavailable. This was in 1973, and Vertigo was one of them. The other was, there were a number, Rear Window, Rope, a number of films. Now, at the time, no one really understood what had happened. We couldn't see these films anymore, even on television. But in fact, Hitchcock himself pulled the films from distribution, apparently so that he could get his estate in order. Now, at the time, there were secret screenings. Some people had private prints here and there in New York and L.A., and a particular case of Vertigo that only added to the mystique of the picture. And when it came back into circulation in 1984, along with the other films that had been held back, it needed work, but the new prints that they made weren't made from the original negative, and the color was completely wrong. The color scheme of Vertigo was extremely unusual, and this was a major disappointment. In the meantime, the original negatives, the elements, needed serious attention. 10 years later, Bob Harris and Jim Katz did a full-scale restoration for Universal. It was very expensive. The picture was originally shot in the VistaVision process, and so they had to do their restoration in 70 millimeter, which was as close as you can get to VistaVision, because that format's gone now. At that point, they had to work from extremely damaged sound and picture elements, but at least the major restoration has been done. You can see it in this form. And as the years went by, more and more people saw Vertigo and came to appreciate its hypnotic beauty and very strange obsessive focus. Obsessive focus. man is hired to follow a woman. And the woman appears to be haunted by the legend of her great-grandmother and that woman's tragic life. She goes into trances, absences that put her in danger. She sees a vision of her own death at an old mission in Northern California that is a bell tower. He brings her there to cure her. She climbs the tower. He tries to go after her, but he can't because he suffers from vertigo, and he just watches helplessly as she jumps to her death. Now that's just the first half of the film. And that's only the plot. But as in the case of many great films, maybe all of them, we don't keep going back for the plot. Vertigo is a matter of mood as much as a matter of storytelling. The special mood of San Francisco where the past is eerily alive and around you at all times. The mist in the air from the Pacific that refracts the light. The unease of the hero played by James Stewart, the lead. Bernard Herrmann's haunting score. And as the film critic B. Kite wrote, you haven't really seen Vertigo until you've seen it again. So for those of you who haven't seen it even once, when you do, you'll know what I mean. In 1952, the British film magazine Sight and Sound started conducting a poll. They do it every 10 years now. They asked film people from around the world, and directors, writers, producers, critics, to list what they thought were the 10 greatest films of all time. And then they tallied the results and they published them. In 1952, number one became Vittorio De Sica's great neorealist picture, Bicycle Thieves. 10 years later, in 1962, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane was at the top of the list, number one. It stayed there for the next 40 years. Now, Kane is a masterpiece, of course. It was released in 1941 with a lot of fanfare, and while it wasn't a great financial success, it was generally regarded as a milestone in the art of cinema. Rediscovered in the 1950s by my generation, on television, actually, and considered one of the greatest films ever made, and still is. It's also regarded as an essentially American film about drive, ambition, failure, and again, like Vertigo, time. Now, as I said, Citizen Kane was number one for 40 years until last year, 2012, when it was displaced by a movie that sort of just came and went in 1958, and that came very, very close to being lost to us forever, and that's Vertigo. And by the way, so does Citizen Kane, because the original negative was burned in a fire in the mid-70s in L.A. So my point is not only do we have to preserve everything, but most importantly, we can't afford to let ourselves be guided by cultural standards, particularly now. I mean, there was a time when the average person wasn't even aware of box office grosses. But since the 80s, it's become kind of a sport and really a form of judgment. It culturally trivializes film. And for young people today, that's what they know. Who made the most money? Who was the most popular? Who is the most popular now as opposed to last year, last month, last week? And now the cycles of popularity are down to a matter of hours, minutes, seconds. And the work that's been created out of seriousness and real passion is lumped together with the work that really hasn't. Then amidst all this chaos, we have to remember we may think we know what's going to last and what isn't. We may feel absolutely sure of ourselves, but we really don't know. We can't know. We have to remember Vertigo and the Civil War plates and that Sumerian tablet. And also remember Moby Dick. It sold very few copies when it was printed in 1849. And that many copies that weren't sold were destroyed in a warehouse fire, that it was dismissed by many, and that Herman Melville's greatest novel, one of the greatest works in literature, was only reclaimed in the 1920s. So we also have to think about where we are now. We need to remember that there are other values beyond the financial, and that our American artistic heritage has to be preserved and shared by all of us. Just as we learn to take pride, in our poets and writers and jazz and blues, well, we need to take pride in our cinema, our great American art form. Granted, we weren't the only ones who invented the movies, and we certainly weren't the only ones who made great films in the 20th century, but to a large extent, the art of cinema and its development has been linked to us, to our country. It's a big responsibility. And we need to say to ourselves that the moment has come when we have to treat every last moving image as reverently and respectfully as the oldest book in the Library of Congress. I thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stay for a conversation with Martin Scorsese and Kent Jones.
Oh, my good man. Sit.
Okay.
Sit for a while.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
So, I wanted to ask you, what do you think Vertigo did for its opening weekend gross?
It didn't do very well, but I saw it at the Capitol Theater in New York in VistaVision, by the way. We went in the middle. That's what we used to do in those days. We liked it. I was about 15 years old. Our friends, we liked it. We couldn't really quite tell what it was about, but we liked the film. Years later, I kept watching it and watching it, but it was quite beautiful, and we liked it.
You went in the middle? You went in the middle?
Yes, that's what you did in those days until Hitchcock told us not to. With Psycho, we had to wait online. We used to say that's where we came in. That's the line.
Right,
this is where we came in. No. Sometimes we can see the film over again, Oh, God.
In the talk, you were talking about seeing things through the lens of your own time. And then people from born in other times seeing them through different lenses. And there's a story that you told me about 2001.
Oh, yes.
That I think is really relevant to this.
Well, when I talked about seeing work and judging work, not, how should I say, out of its context, out of the bias of its time, too. One could be aware of what it was like when the film opened or when the book was published, but sometimes things happen because of timing. And in the case of 2001, Kubrick was working on the film for a very long time in England, spending a lot of money, secretive, and word was getting around. MGM Studios was in trouble. Cinerama was having difficulty. That was also part of the making of the film. In any event, the word was getting around. The critics in New York and around the country were getting really annoyed and say, we're spending this much money. Yeah. What is he doing? Yeah. What is he doing? What are they all doing over there in England?
No stars.
With no movie stars.
Yeah.
No movie stars. Yeah. Costing a fortune, And so, ultimately, it was in 1968, at the press screening with all the major critics in New York, they couldn't wait for the film to unspool Cinerama, the theater. They had a lot of bias going in, and I think the film before that he made was Lolita, was it?
No, Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove. Mm-hmm. And so they loved Dr. Strangelove, but they were, this didn't feel right. So they sat there and, in a sense, show me. Also, you have to remember that in those days, too, and still even now, with film reviewers and critics, they see a lot of things. You see 2 films a day, maybe one very, very a minor film, and then something major comes down, and people get tired, and they're sitting there and they're waiting, and this thing comes up. And the first image is the Thus Spake Zarathustra, the moon aligned, you know. And there were titters of laughter in the audience because a film called Ice Station Zebra had just opened. They just saw it a week ago. It opens the same way. What the hell is this? I mean, then they're sitting there going, look at this, Ice Station Zebra, Ice Station Zebra, Ice Station Zebra. Yeah. So they're all again, then The Dawn of Man, apes. It's supposed to be a space film. They started laughing because there was another film that had just opened called Planet of the Apes. And that was it. And they were watching these apes 45 minutes up here. Yeah. What is this? Yeah. The men in ape suits. We just saw this damn thing. Yeah. Can he be more original than that with all the money we gave him? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. No stars in this.
No stars. Yeah. And so the picture was panned. Yeah. And it took about a week and a half before people just started going to see it and didn't listen to the critics anymore. Yeah. You see, within that context, though, there was a lot of bias against it. Many films, I don't like to. I used to try to find out about films over the years and what went on while I was making it, and it spoiled it for me in a way.
In
a
lot
of pictures. Well, I didn't really need to know certain things. It's because if the set is very, very cheaply made, I didn't know that. You see, I didn't feel it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It destroys the illusion of the first impact the picture has on me.
Yeah.
And there was another one too. Well, there's another story, real fast. The Powell Pressburger films. Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger in England, who made The Red Shoes, A Matter of Life and Death with David Niven. I Know Where I'm Going. About 5 or 6 masterpieces.
49 Parallel.
49 Parallel.
Small Back Room.
And they made a film called The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp in 1943 in Technicolor. They were advised by the War Ministry not to do it.
That's right. Because
of the theme in the film, a friendship between an Englishman and a German, played by Roger Libsey as the Englishman and Anton Walbrook as the German. They had to wait for the Technicolor camera. Yeah. They were given everything. In other words, they had to actually steal all borrow the military equipment for the certain scenes. They weren't given much. And they were also told, if you do this picture, if you go through with it, the old man doesn't like it. It's Churchill. He doesn't like the idea right now. It's not good. And you'll never get a knighthood. They didn't get it. They didn't get the knighthood, but they got the film. The problem was that by the mid-50s, things had changed. England had changed, of course, the world. And their films fell out of favor to the point where I didn't even know. Nothing was written about these two men. And so we began to search them out. And one of the key films was this Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. The main reason is that it was originally 2 hours and 46 minutes. A beautiful epic.
Yeah, and cut to ribbons.
But it was re-edited many times. So I only saw it in black and white at first. Then we saw it finally in 16 millimeter color on PBS in New York. A 2-hour version where they straightened out the storylines because there were a lot of flashbacks and that sort of thing. And it was still pretty interesting. And so it was very moving too. It didn't matter. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I didn't know what had happened with the Ministry of War. I had no idea. I also didn't understand the behavior of certain characters, the British Empire, as opposed, In any event, it took many years, and finally in the 80s they reconstructed the original film. And what happened was that after doing Red Shoes, we were able to get the financing, the Film Foundation, to restore Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, which took quite a while because it was 2 hours and 46 minutes of Technicolor, 3-strip, like that Red Shoes that you saw, only much tougher to do because it was older. And the negative was even worse shape. And finally it was re-released last year. And interestingly enough, the Blu-ray was re-released recently, and now articles are being written about it as the best British film ever made. New generations seeing it. Of course, they're too young to remember the devastation of the war and the horror, but they see something else in it, something that has, just sustained itself over the years. It's the same film.
Yeah.
You see?
And it was a film that was really controversial at the time because also it was made during wartime, and one of the most sympathetic and likable characters in the movie is a German.
I know, yeah. It was Because Emmerich Pressburger was Austrian, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah. So, these things do change. And Andrew Sarris, actually, who we mentioned before, came to love it more than Citizen Kane.
That's
a
right.
film about the passage of time.
But there's no doubt that Kane, looking at Kane changed my life when I was on TV, and the way Cassavetes filmed Shadows, and a number of key films. On the Waterfront was the first. But I got to tell you, in the past 10, 15 years, the film that I watch, like listening to a piece of music, is Blimp, the Colonel Blimp film, more than Kane, more than the others. Yeah. Vertigo, yes. The others are there. They made the impact on me. They are great works, but these are richer in a way. And as maybe you're just getting older, it's the same film,
You just mentioned On the Waterfront, and when we were at the beginning of the talk, you were talking about seeing the films with your family, with your mother and father, sometimes with your brother.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And that you were experiencing these feelings, but through the codes of the time. And that I know that as you were growing up, the movies that were being made were breaking down those codes. And On the Waterfront was one of them.
Yes, I mean, the code of the time, for example, even if people were married, there had to be double beds.
Yep. Separate beds.
Separate beds.
Kisses could only last a certain length of time.
That's right. Kisses could last only a certain amount of time, that sort of thing. So you're really seeing things where people understood what it meant, but you didn't see it played out. In the case of On the Waterfront, that happened. The ending of the film is a very upbeat ending. In reality, we know it wouldn't have been that way. It probably wasn't that way. And interesting for me, I was 10 years old, 1952. Right around that time, The Moon is Blue is made, Otto Preminger. Around the same time, Stanley Kramer starts producing films that have to do with very, very Home of the Brave, very, very powerful themes, even later Inherit the Wind and really thought-provoking pictures. The thing is that between Preminger and Kramer and Kazan, the code was being taken down and things were being changed until finally, by the time that I got to make a movie, we're from another planet in a way.
Yeah.
The filmmakers of my time. All we could do is cherish and become nourished, continually be nourished by the work of the past. Yeah. But as much as we may have thought of ourselves as a director, just give me a script and I'll go do a pirate film, or I'll do this, I'll do that. It doesn't exist. We're a different world, different kinds of animals too. Yeah. But it was being taken down. Of course, I was raised Roman Catholic, and Kazan's films were mainly on the condemned list, so you couldn't see them. Mm-hmm. Streetcar Named Desire, forget it, you couldn't get it.
But your mom wanted to.
Which one?
But that gave your mom a reason to see them, right?
Well, my mother, she took me to see Duel in the Sun because it was condemned.
Right.
But she used the excuse that I liked Westerns.
Right.
Scarred me for life.
Yeah.
It's a terrifying film. It's a beautiful film, but it's...
It's the first one you ever saw.
It's the first film I remember seeing, yeah.
Can you imagine?
Ooh. But that code broke down in 10 years or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then it occurs to me that in the years after that other codes have come about. They're just not officially enforced. They're just kind of there. They're present.
Yeah, yeah.
It kind of happens that way. It's interesting. I was also struck by you were talking about Socrates and Phaedrus and his objection to writing and reading. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about objecting to writing and reading. But his hysteria about it, or his objection to it, is reminiscent of it. You keep hearing that argument over and over again. People used to object to stereopticons. They thought that they were going to, ruin
novels.
people. Novels, right?
Novels were
long novels.
Well, Don Quixote.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, so the same argument keeps coming up again and again.
Yeah. I mean, yes, one has to be focused, one has to understand what the values are.
Yeah.
How you guide yourself through this morass of, a barrage of information now. For me, I'm older, it's different, but for the younger ones, they think of the world differently, and this is not a criticism, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
They perceive the world differently, they think differently. You see them putting a video together, for example, the cut doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
The image doesn't mean anything. It's something else that's going on. Mm-hmm. Something I can't be a part of. I don't know.
Yeah.
But to them, they can't describe it. They just do it. because that's what they see.
Yeah. And they're very fluent visually.
Very, very
the cut.
fluent. Yeah, the cut, the tracking, camera, they got, the technique is down. I mean, the technique of making a movie, Orson Welles always said, he said, you can learn, you can't go any place to learn how to make a film. He said, you can learn in 4 hours everything you need to know about cameras.
Mm-hmm.
The rest has to come from here.
Yeah.
It has to be your passion, you know?
Yeah. Although he also watched Stagecoach by John Ford 37 times.
Before he directed Citizen Kane, he watched Stagecoach by John Ford.
Yep.
That was over and over again. Yeah.
His teacher. You know, I wanted to touch on an issue that you brought up, which is the issue of preservation. And as you said, you know, it's an ongoing process. I think that there is a lingering consciousness that people have that film is going to kind of take care of itself. It's going to kind of preserve itself.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with the, when as I said, Bob Rosen pulled us together and said, listen, let's put all your focus here. And I would go to the heads of the studios and talk to them and try to explain why they needed to take care of their library. And this was right around the time, I think VHS was around at the time, of course, in 1990.
Yep.
But in the 80s, the early 80s, they really... you have to understand that when there was no video and no subsidiary market that way except for television, what were they going to do with these prints? Throw them away, you know? But the problem has been that it was like Bob Daly over at Warner Brothers when he looked at me and says, what's going to stop us 20 years from now having the same conversation? I said, putting a program in order, you know? Putting a steady program. Things change. People, you know, finish their jobs at the studios. New people come in. Mm-hmm. They're young. They have a different frame of reference and a different way of thinking about what the value of this great art form is. And so they don't really think about that in many cases because they're really too young to know. I think they're too young to realize. And they have to keep a job. They have to make a job. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to make hit pictures to keep a studio going. Yeah. And at the same time, worry about some obscure film that was made in 1953.
Right. That's not going to bring in much in the way of revenue.
It's not going to bring any money into the... and, of course, the corporations that own these things, the studios. So it's very, very difficult. I had a thing happen to me, it's about 20 years ago, a film I made. I won't say the title. But the studio was kind of expressed themselves in print, actually. And that's when I realized things really did change. The film, they projected a $60 million profit. They projected it. They said, but you know what? We're not interested in that. We want 150, 160, a $200 million profit. We don't want to make films like this anymore. So 60 million is not enough.
Yeah.
Apparently.
So they tell me. Yeah.
It's not enough.
Yeah.
Why, you know, it just is an interesting thing because we used to come from making films, people made films in the 50s and 60s, the 70s. Yes, they tried to make money on these films, but they let the film play. Yeah. It was a different thing. The value was somewhat different. Yeah. Because there were a lot of people who were involved in making movies that, it would be great if the film made a lot of money, but they were just as happy, in many cases, for the prestige of being involved with a certain kind of film that was made.
Right.
And that, when I heard that 60 million or if the projected 60 is not enough, then we're out of it. Yeah. It's a different industry. Yeah. In a way. Because then that rules everything. The picture's got to make 200 million.
Yeah. And then more.
And more.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of money that goes into press and the advertising now, too. Yeah. So anyway, this was an indication of the situation.
They've never seen the Boxing Cats, though. So
the Boxing Cats, I know.
Or been to New Jersey. I don't know if it's still... that's enough about New Jersey. But that actually, the story that you just told about the film That Shall Remain Nameless, dovetails with what you said about box office grosses and cultural trivialization. It really is a widespread, it's a judgment.
Yeah.
It's a marginalization.
It is a judgment. And it's an odd thing, too, to go to the movies just because a film opens.
Yeah.
I guess it's a communal experience. Kids all go. Younger people, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
I don't know.
I don't know. What's a question for you?
I don't know. It's a thing to do because you want to the next day everybody's talking about it.
Yeah.
But
sitting through the previews is not much of a communal experience.
No, the previews. No.
Communal revulsion.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, that's it.
But I think what I'm saying is that it's just a place to go to now.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what's playing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose that that's true. And then the way that I remember the box office gross thing started somewhere in the 80s, and it's gotten more and more to the point where it's just this mantra.
Yes, it is. It is.
Repeated everywhere.
It's reported in the news every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I got to say that younger people think, well, that's the good thing, because it beat the record of another film that opened on a holiday that was, and there's all these qualifications.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, but that was a holiday that didn't
Right.
have this with it and that. So this, percentage-wise, we are ahead, and it goes,
Yeah.
What are they? Well, it's a very disturbing thing, and I, quite honestly, of course, the cinema has become something different from the films I was showing you here. Now, it is different. Doesn't mean it's bad. It's just that it's different, and it's. I look forward to the what the young will bring us, what the new filmmakers will bring us.
Yeah.
To do something new. The image, the whole idea of a solid image of the image you see like in the Red Shoes or the Vertigo film, just the way it goes from Jimmy Stewart at the bar, and then it pans and tracks, and you see this red-walled restaurant, all these people, but there's a strip of green, emerald green, and then the camera moves in on her. And that's a very strong, directed, imagined, composed way of making you see and understand the story. But that's, in many cases, that's gone now in terms of, let's say, more commercial films, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it.
Quick cutting.
There are
I do
exceptions,
like quick cutting.
there are exceptions here and there. There are films that, but I mean.
Well, an exception like in There Will Be Blood or The Master.
The Master.
Those are exceptions.
Yeah, or the Terrence Malick film, The
Terry
Tree
Malick
of Life. Yeah. We were talking about preservation before, and I also wanted to touch on restoration. And the tools that you mentioned that were used for the Red Shoes, I remember before those tools were available, and I seem to remember that the first film that really profited from that was The Matinee Idol by Frank Capra. It was a film that would not have existed had it not been for digital cleanup.
It was a silent film made by Frank Capra called The Matinee Idol.
Yeah.
And there was just no way to restore it photochemically, celluloid, because it's gone. I mean, that's why I say, while they're trying, you may have a list of films that they're going to try to restore, but by the time, you get to the 10th one, the negative is destroyed. There's no way to work with it. But the Matinee Idol that Columbia did, it was amazing because it was done digitally. There was no way that film would ever be seen if it wasn't transferred and reconstructed digitally.
Could not have been done photochemically.
No way.
Yeah.
The La Dolce Vita, too,
the
Fellini film that the Film Foundation recently did, was digital.
Yeah.
Because the photochemical process was getting very difficult with the negatives. The question is, of course, people who love cinema, and I do and you do, but they say, is it really cinema then?
Right. Because it's not celluloid.
It's not celluloid, and it's not projected. It doesn't have that flicker. It doesn't have that. It does something to the eye and to your perception of the imagery with that breathing in the frame. And they say, well, you can add that. Well, why add it when it's a new medium?
Right.
Let's use the new medium, you see. And in the meantime, try to preserve what's left of the old medium with digitizing it. And then transferring that to film, you see. And ultimately what we're talking about here is cinematic language rather than film versus digital.
Right.
It's all cinematic language. It's all moving images.
Yep.
And we're just entering another phase.
Yep.
There are problems, though. I mean, in some cases, there are some classic films, but there are not many. No one's around anymore to tell the timer or the restorer and the
that's right.
What the shading should be like on the face of Natalie Wood or James Dean and that sort of thing. And in one case recently, there is someone around. I was dealing with it, and he says, "No, that I got to tell you that the face in that person right there is too much light." I know it was related to the director, and he said he would have liked it. He wanted it more shade, more dark. And the tendency, if you don't know,
Yeah.
And all you have these old prints that aren't very good.
You want to be able to see everything.
You think you want to be able to see everything. So we need, the restorers need the direction of whomever's left.
Yeah.
And also whatever prints are left of the other versions of the film that were made before. Unfortunately, many films made in 53, 54 on, the color didn't last very well. And so you can't really use that as an example.
But it becomes an act of interpretation at some point.
In a way, some restorations could become a reinterpretation of the film.
Yep.
Especially if there's nobody around to tell you what they intended.
Yep. We're getting a signal.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Marty.
Bye. Thank you.
So Jim's coming out.
Thank you.